Hi guys, my name is Tania and this is my August wrap-up. So I finished 13 books in the month of August and I shot myself in the foot a little bit because having taken part in the booktubeathon, I then didn't wrap up the books that I read during the booktubeathon and I now have to wrap them all up in one big video. I don't mind watching quarter of an hour long, half an hour long videos by other booktubers, but as a relatively new and small booktuber, I feel quite uncomfortable making really long videos because I don't want to force people to stick around that long. So where I'd normally go through the books in the chronological order that I read them, this month I'm going to chop it up and change it a bit. I have a series and a couple of audiobooks that I want to do as 2 chunks rather than spreading them out over the course of the month and confusing myself and everybody else in the process. So first up I have my booktubeathon books, and the first book that I read was Me and Earl and the Dying Girl by Jessie Andrews, and I hated Greg as a narrator. I'm sorry. I just think that there's funny, self-deprecating humour and then there is this book which just takes it too far and you spend the whole book with this guy just going, oh no, I'm an awful person, everything I do is rubbish, I'm rubbish. And I hated it, and it just completely disconnected me from Greg and consequently all the other characters as we're seeing them through his eyes. I also think that in order to be quirky and weird, you don't constantly have to make puke jokes. You can make a puke joke every now and then and be funny. It's not the be all and end all of being a weird quirky person that when someone talks to you, the only thing you can reply with is a vomit joke. It grated so much. I was also slightly wary going into this book as I stole it off Beth's discard pile, and she had problems with a section in this book which is kind of biphobic, and I agree. There is a section in which Earl just goes off on a rant about how bisexuality can't be a thing, and Greg just sits there going, I kind of agree. Yeah, I see your point. And then it all gets turned into a sexual innuendo and it's like it's been brushed off, but it's just a truly awful section of writing and I couldn't stand it. So at the end of the day I gave this book 2 stars because I felt that it had such potential. Like, I generally love self-deprecating humour and this just took it too far and made me hate it. I then moved on to something completely different and read In Memory, which is a debut novel by my friend Josh, or Joshua Sutton as is on his book. This was in fact a pleasant surprise. I was expecting a full-on horror type book. This mentions demon possession in the blurb, and this was more the fantasy end of demon possession type books, which I am ultimately cool with. So this is quite a little book, and it didn't give us a particularly deep exploration of the characters and their motivations as we kind of flip between them through the course of the novel, but this is the first book in a series, so hopefully that is something that will be developed as the story goes on. We're very much thrown into the deep end of this story with all of the characters, so the chaos that they're experiencing we're also experiencing, which I found really cool. I think this was a good first novel. I gave it 3 out of 5 stars and I am excited to see what happens next. My third book is what I would call a charity shop auto-buy, as whenever I see a book by this author in a charity shop or a second-hand shop, I will buy her books because I find them a good bit of light relief. And the author is Sarah Dessen, the book What Happened to Goodbye. What I really enjoy is that although Sarah Dessen's tagline is read her once and fall in love, and she's very much known for writing these contemporary romances, in this book you're introduced to the character that is obviously going to be the male love interest, but the romance doesn't kick in until over halfway through the book, and the author spends a lot of time dealing with the family issues that McLean, the main character, is facing. And yes, she eventually involves the guy in the family issues, but he is not the answer to the problem. But there's a really nice gentle romance here that kind of blossoms in the second half of the book and isn't the be-all and end-all of this storyline, which I really enjoyed. So at the end of the day I gave this book 3 out of 5 stars. The final book that I read during the booktubeathon was Mrs. Rosie and the Priest by Giovanni Boccaccio. I read this at nearly midnight on the last day of the booktubeathon, so I can't remember that much about it. It hasn't left much of an impression other than a passing irritation at its being a generally amoral set of stories parading as moralities. But it was a quick fun read, so I gave it 3 out of 5 stars. So during the month of August I decided to catch up on the Throne of Glass series. I'd read the first book and thought it was okay, but I wasn't getting the buzz that everyone else was from it. But my friends really wanted me to read it and I thought I'd try and catch up before the next book was released on the 1st of September. Right at the beginning of the month I finished Crown of Midnight and I began to feel a bit more for the characters, but I was still feeling the pressure to read it and wasn't particularly smitten. I enjoyed it, it was fun, but there's just too much hype behind it. After the booktubeathon, I moved on to Heir of Fire, and this book introduced new characters with separate plot lines, and it was at this point that actually I started to see what people are talking about with this series. This is also the book during which things that we're prepped for in earlier books that annoyed me at the time because they had no reason to be there, they actually begin to form large parts of the plot, whereas in the first book they were just floating bits of information that annoyed me because they seemed to have no relevance to the plot that I thought this series was going to have. By the end, I was kind of hooked and wanted the next book, and I need to know what happens to Dorian because he is my precious cinnamon roll and what's happening to him. Finally, from this series, I read The Assassin's Blade, which are the 5 prequel novellas to the Throne of Glass series. I was a bit weirded out by this because they were basically a novel in all but name. The 5 novellas flow pretty much into each other, they are linked, and even just a linking paragraph would have meant that this book was a whole novel rather than 5 apparent novellas that were one storyline. And I found at the time I wasn't that fussed about this. It's all stuff that we know happens but fleshed out more, and it was nice to have the backstory, but I was a bit meh about it. However, since finishing reading these in August, the new book has come out, and there are characters in Queen of Shadows that we wouldn't know about if we hadn't read The Assassin's Blade, so it is kind of important, but I wasn't that fussed about it. Next up, I had a craving for some more diverse characters. This is something I've been wanting to get into more this year, and I haven't really achieved it. So I had a flick through my Kindle and came across a book called My Lady King by Kayla Bash. I am going to roll with that pronunciation, but if I am wrong, I'm really sorry. But I downloaded this around Christmas time because it was floating around my Twitter as a good example of a book containing LGBTQ+ characters, and it definitely delivered on that front. By creating a world that is fully accepting of LGBTQ+ characters, the author created this natural flow in this story that just allowed the characters to flourish in their environment, and in that respect it was really stunning. So in a story with a really diverse cast of characters, the problems that arise come from things like sibling rivalry and evil witches, rather than people's orientations or race. This might make absolutely no sense, but I found that it showed acceptance by not having to show acceptance. Otherwise, it was a really fun fantasy romp that reminded me of the kind of thing that I really loved to read in my early teens, and I enjoyed it. I just wish there'd been more of it, so I gave it 3 out of 5 stars. So August was the month that I finally read I'll Give You the Sun by Jandy Nelson. This was another book containing LGBT characters that I really enjoyed. So this book follows 2 twins, Noah and Jude, and it jumps in time between the 2 twins' stories, with Noah aged 13 and Jude aged 16. So throughout the book we're aware that things have happened to create a massive rift between the 2 of them, and we see them dealing with this in their own ways at different times. So we see the sequence of events both unfold and untangle at the same time throughout the story, which is the kind of narration that I love in a book. I feel like all the things that tie up neatly in a bow at the end of this should probably be seen as too perfect, but that's the sort of thing that I find really satisfying, so I had no complaints about it. And Beth continues to laugh at me because I burst into tears at the end because, quote, it's too happy. But I read this in one sitting and it gets 5 out of 5 stars from me. After I'd finished I Give You the Sun and lay on Beth's bed, a slightly teary wreck, she decided this would be a really good time for me to read Eleanor Park by Rainbow Rowell, which is the last Rainbow Rowell book that I needed to read. And I loved this, but I spent a lot of time cringing at the accuracy of a teenage infatuation where they're too scared to talk to each other in case it goes wrong. And having been a fat 16-year-old, I feel like I could have done with this book when I was that age, as I personally spent a lot of time worrying that even people that said they loved me as I was were looking at me and seeing my fat, disgusting body, and when Eleanor was feeling those things it just really resonated. And the dual perspective in this book really begins to try and debunk that, and it was something that I've not seen before, and it just really touched a chord, like, in my little heart. I gave it 5 out of 5 stars. The final physical book that I read in the month of August was The Long Earth by Terry Pratchett and Stephen Baxter, and I borrowed this book from the library. This is the first book in a series with a kind of dystopian feel as the course of humanity alters when the instructions for a device that will enable people to step between parallel Earths is released online. And whilst we see the immediate aftermath of this, we also see into the future and what begins happening further down the line. Whilst the premise of this book was really good, I found that we followed a cast of people who I just didn't care about. The characters I was most interested in were the nuns, who are mentioned by one of the main characters in this book frequently, but who we never actually get to meet, so it was kind of a non-point for me really. I just felt like this was a bit of a nothing book book, there was a vague plot, but it didn't really go anywhere, because this is basically trying to set up what happens to society with all of these parallel worlds and what the implications of the Long Earth are, whilst also showing us the extent and variations between the different planets. So the plot is in its entirety world building, and it wasn't particularly exciting. I gave this book 2 out of 5 stars. The final 2 books that I have to talk about are the audiobooks that I finished. I work part-time as a cleaner, which is a pretty lonely job, so I spend my 7 hours a week cleaning, listening to audiobooks, and over the past 2 months I have been listening to and have finally finished 1Q84 by Haruki Murakami. I found this a crazily detailed and immersive experience, but ultimately it was kind of unsatisfying, and actually the ending, in which not everything is resolved, ties in with fiction that is used in the book and the messages that this book ultimately gives off. But after so much detail, it's kind of a letdown, which I guess is kind of the point, but it's also just so unsatisfying. So having read reviews, I figure that this probably wasn't my best choice for a first Murakami book, but it was enjoyable and I gave it 3 out of 5 stars. And finally, I continued with the Chaos Walking trilogy by Patrick Ness and listened to the whole of The Ask and the Answer, which is the second book in the series. I wasn't as crazy in love with this book as I was with the first, but Patrick Ness's writing though. I ended up weeping and sobbing loudly over a character who I had initially thought irredeemable. It was intense. This book takes the idea of the sides that we had in The Knife of Never Letting Go and completely polarises them to the point where it actually stops things from being clear cut and we don't know who to trust, whose side to take, and ultimately what's right. Mayor Prentice is still a creep. I love that we have no idea if there's going to be a black and white good and evil answer at the end of this, and I can't wait to conclude the trilogy, and gave this book 4 out of 5 stars. So yeah, this has been my August wrap up. I know that there are months that I have missed, but I can't keep up with it, so I'm just going to try and keep moving and keep doing things, and some of the books that I read during the months that I didn't wrap up I really want to review, because that's something that I want to start doing. So hopefully some of those will be appearing soon and the ball shall begin rolling again. I hope that you're all doing really well. I hope everything's going well if you're going back to school, if you're going back to uni, if you're going back to college, all those things. If you're starting a new job, I just started a new job, I'm terrified, but I hope all those things are going really well for you. I hope that you've all had amazing summers and that everything in the future is looking good, and I will see you soon. Goodbye! The light is changing. I just noticed it was kind of dark in the last book and now it's kind of light. Welcome to Wales.